Alright, what's going on, all you cool cats and kittens? Today we're getting down to business. I have one of the most controversial videos for you ever. And that's because I'm going to be doing a build video. And unfortunately, the comments I can already predict will be ruthless. However, what we'll be going over today is how to build a Mag Sorc for success. How you can contour it to your playstyle, how you can use it for different PvP scenarios, whether the different mythicals you can use, different monster sets, different setups, different skills, different attributes. We're going to be talking about all of that because, honestly, as someone who has PvP'd quite a bit, I always feel like there's multiple ways to make a build, and you don't have to do all these wholesale changes. There's small tweaks that you can do that I feel like just get overlooked, and people are so quick to just throw out their whole build, scrap it, start over. Because I just don't like copying people's builds. Like I just feel like it doesn't. If you don't play exactly like a specific player does, you're not going to have the same success that that player does. Let alone, mind you, also that I could just throw in stock footage. I mean, using a completely different setup. Also, I might be getting my ass kicked for the other pieces of footage that you're not watching. So that's my initial 2 cents. But I would really appreciate if you guys would like this video. We are still doing our campaign against the rewards, the daily rewards. I have sent an email to ZeniMax. I am unsure how to edit such thing, but I will be making it a short, likely, or I may put it at the end of like the Golden Vendor review video, depending on what you guys think. But this is a video that you guys requested, talking about Mag Sork. And if you'd like to be entered into the giveaway, all you have to do is be a subscriber for one entry, or the other winner will be pulled from a random comment, so you can comment what you think about this build, if you like the Mag Sorc, and what your thoughts are on Mag Sorking it up. So, let's talk about Mag Sorc. So let's start first about total stats and why my build is like this to begin with. Now this is just a hypothetical build that I've been testing out recently. We'll talk about why I'm using this versus other things, so it's a good place to start. You guys are probably already wondering, Jake, you don't have 60,000 gigafarts of spell damage. Why is this? And that is because Mag Sorcs are generally built very differently than other classes. And you may be able to guess why, and if not, I'm going to show you. And that is because of Hardened Ward and also the Light Armor counterpart, which scales off of your max magicka, but is capped at 60% of your total health. Which means the more magicka you have, the better shields you have. Now, some of you who are very astute may notice that I do not have Hardened Ward on my bar, but promise you, we'll get to that. As again, like I'm saying with everything, we're going to be going over everything. We're going to be talking about all the flexibilities amongst the abilities, amongst the sets, amongst the mysticals. You know, there's so much to you can change. You don't have to use the same Mundus, so I promise you there's a lot to talk about. This is just a 1,000-foot overview of the total stats currently, so that's the reason why maximum magicka, maximum health, and maximum stamina are so helpful. The recoveries are also pretty decent because I am a vampire. I'm not currently stage 3. We'll talk a little bit about vampirism at the end. However, that does add to potential magicka costs, which is why I have gone with the Breton. However, you are more than welcome to do this with pretty much any race. We'll talk briefly about races, but I really want to jump into the meat and potatoes of the build. So we are going to do that now. So, as you can see, I am currently using the Ancient Grace with backbar of Ancient Grace, Gaze of Sithis, Necropotence, one-piece Swarm Mothers as it gives both max stam and max magicka, two-piece Trainee, and then the final piece of Ancient Grace there. This is just my overview. We'll again be breaking this down even further into the minutia, but I wanted to start talking about specifics. And that specifics is going to be mythicals, because I feel like your play style has to be contoured to a mythical. So first, let's talk about potential mythicals. There are so many good mythicals. However, my favorite one is definitely the Gaze of Sithis, as we'll outline / have outlined. Having those total max stats is extremely helpful. You need that max magicka, you need that max health, and getting so much maximum health and armor in one spot pretty much opens up a whole lot of versatility for you, because in general, and you'll see me talk about this throughout the video, I generally recommend at least one defensive setup. One defensive set. It could be a mythical, it could be a monster set, it could be a 5-piece set. I generally recommend at least one, because I think that you need at least one to kind of get you through those executioner strikes, to get you through all that damage. And we'll talk a little bit about Vampirism a bit later, but overall, Gaze of Sithis pairs super well with pretty much any other sets that you have. You could throw it with Crafty, you could throw it with Necropotence like we have. There's so many good versatility setups that you can run with the Gaze of Sithis. I can't recommend it anymore. However, I will note too that I generally have traits of pretty much exclusively all impen pieces. However, if you are running Gaze of Sithis, you are able to also consider pieces of well fitted. I think that that's a really good, consideration that you could kind of make going forward. So if you find yourself running out of stamina because you're dodge rolling too much, consider some pieces of well fitted, but that's the Gaze of Sithis. Next, we have the Markin Ring of Majesty. Now, the Markin Ring of Majesty is super interesting because it gives you weapon, spell damage, and armor based on 3-piece sets, which, as you've seen, we've talked about a lot of 3-piece sets. You could even consider even more 3-piece sets if you really wanted, like Trainee. You could consider Willpower. You could consider Ancient Grace. There's a lot of really good 3-piece sets out there. Here's why I don't like this, though, for Mag Sorcs, but I do recognize that it is used quite a bit by other people, so we're going to talk about it. And now, if you can spot the problem with this, you've paid attention this far in the video, and I give you a thumbs up. So, the problem is we don't get maximum mag or health from this item. That's our problem with this item. We could build this to give us the 300 weapon and spell damage with 3,400 and blah 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 armor, and that will be just peachy. We could still have the ability to bar swap. We don't lose that ability. We could still block. We don't lose that, but we're not gaining health. So if you use the Markin Ring of Majesty, you're probably going to have to trade it with something like a healthy trait to give yourself more health. You may have to put a health enchant on your body pieces. You may have to switch to the health Mundus stone. Like, you will have to curve your playstyle because you're going to be missing that health. And overall, as far as weapon and spell damage and armor, I just don't feel like it's as needed on a sorcerer, whereas I would suggest it more on a different type of class. Death Dealer's Fete is a super interesting item when it comes to sorcerers, and I actually really like this ring. It does suffer from some drawbacks, though, so we're going to talk about it. But let's talk about the pros first. If you wear this with those sets that we're wearing right now, you will see enormous total numbers of maximum stats. You could easily be pushing almost 60,000 max magicka. Ridiculously high numbers of total maximum magicka. And the main benefit, too, as you may have picked up on, Gaze of Sithis takes up a head slot. You can put this on a sorcerer that has a monster set, if you would so choose. So we're going to talk about monster sets next, but this is going to be a mythical, like the Markin Ring, that goes with it. Now, the Markin Ring, you wouldn't want a monster set because you want more 3-piece sets. Whereas Death Dealer's Fete, you can easily put on a monster set. So consider that when you guys are considering the Death Dealer's Fete. But let's talk a little bit about the negatives. I don't need to be a negative Nancy here, but this is really good for group, open world, and battlegrounds play. However, it does take a hot second. It takes 60 seconds to build to the maximum, and you lose it pretty quickly. I mean, you might not think that 4 seconds when you're out of combat is a lot, but that's a lot. And when you die, it also gets reset also. So that's important to consider for your battlegrounds. So if you're someone who's very confident in their ability to live and their ability to do like high DPS, because as we talked about earlier, remember, the more maximum magicka you have, the more damage you're going to be dealing. The more health you have, the higher your shields are going to be. So your highs will be very high, but your lows are going to be pretty low, because basically when you're starting this thing off, you're not going to be getting any benefit. For every second it'll increase, but you may need that benefit sooner rather than later. So this pairs really well actually with a very interesting setup that I've been running. So you saw that I was wearing Swarm Mothers, but you can also do 1-piece Swarm Mother and 1-piece Stonekeeper. So I could put Swarm Mother on the head and Stonekeepers on the arms. This may cause some people's heads to explode, but when you're trying to just build total stats and you're okay with that, this is a really great way to do that. And this also kind of transitioned into another bit of a point where we talk about proc versus no proc sets. We'll talk about that. I know that you guys may be thinking it right now, but we do have one more mythical that I want to talk about first, and it is the controversial one, and that is the Oakensoul ring. You can certainly use the Oakensoul ring. It gives you tons of buffs. It gives you all sorts of neat things. Do I like it? No. Do I recognize that it's good? Yes. You can pretty much run a super easy gear setup with it, with a super easy, monster set. You could pretty much run Balorgs, which we'll talk about when we talk about monster sets here in a minute. You could run pretty much straight DPS sets and be an absolute freaking glass cannon with a decent chunk of oomph to them. I just don't enjoy it. I don't like the singular playstyle of being on one bar. I do think it's great because you get so much heal from the matriarch, and we'll talk about the matriarch specifically when we get to the bar setup, but the Oakensoul ring just ain't for me. I appreciate its utility, I appreciate its purpose, I appreciate that it's so liked and it's so easy for solo content, and makes it easy to do things like parsing on one bar and whatnot, but I'll be honest, it ain't for me. So this actually brings up an interesting point, though, for sorcerers, because you may notice that there's a lot of people that use sets like Rallying Cry or like the Moon Hunter set, which I think I have in my inventory. You'll see that I have actually quite a few sets in here. That's because I test a lot of things, which is, when you alchemical poison fires increases your weapon and spell damage by 547 for 8 seconds. That's a really neat set, but here's the problem. I prefer my sorcerers to have the stats all the time. And while weapon and spell crit isn't bad, just magicka is my preference. Because that's going to make my shields bigger, that's going to make everything that I do have more oomph to it. That's why, personally, I'm just not a fan of proc sets. For those of you who are new to ESO, a proc set is pretty much like an if this, then that statement. So, for example, I use a poison, the poison procs, I get 547 spell damage. Versus, we'll say spinners, for example, where it's just, here's your penetration. There's no do this to get penetration, it's just, you get penetration. The reason I skipped over Necropotence is technically Necropotence is a proc set because while a pet is active, your magicka is increased by 31, 32. However, I don't really consider it a proc set because it's not like my pet is usually consistently dying. So that's where I don't see it as a traditional proc set. But overall, though, there are some decent proc sets, just overall that you could use on a Templar or a Nightblade that are pretty universally good. I just don't enjoy them. You could throw in something like if you wanted like Unfathomable Darkness or other such, crafted sets like the one where you pop a potion and then, you get all this damage and stuff. And again, weapon and spell damage isn't as good as people give it credit for when it comes to sorcerers. If you were a different class, I would say yes, but you're not. You are specifically a sorcerer who really benefits from those stats, and you really want to have that damage protection. We'll talk a little bit about other ways to mitigate damage when we get to skill bar setups, but now we got monster sets. So personally, I actually really don't believe in a whole lot of monster sets for this. If I was to run a different monster set and take out the Gaze of Sithis, I would either be running Balorgs, which as you can see, Balorgs is a super popular set, gives you weapon and spell damage, which again I'm not a big fan of, but I appreciate as a one piece, and then being able to get all of the weapon and spell, the penetration. I recognize that this is a really good set. If you're running something like the Markin ring or the Oakensoul ring, or another such thing, this could be really good for you. I still drift towards, if I was gonna wear a monster set, I'm actually a huge fan of Zons, because you have so much gap closing potential. You have the ability to be close when you want to, And Zons can really start to do quite a bit of damage. And being able to do this every 20 seconds may sound like that's a long cooldown time, but depending on the type of content that you're doing, it really isn't. And I really do like recommend Zons. Ice Heart is another really decent one that I've seen used if you needed like a defensive setup that also gives you a little bit of extra, mobility, and that you do damage, you get a damage shield, you deal frost damage. Ice Hearts I've seen recommended before, but also consider too, there's a lot of really good one pieces. So Swarm Mothers is a one piece, max stam, max magicka, and we could also throw in Stonekeepers, which is max stam, max magicka, and max health. So don't sleep on just the one piece benefits that you guys can be getting from these sets as well, because that's going to be really good for you guys also. Now, an important thing to note, why do I have one heavy, one medium, and one light? If you're new, basically the Undaunted has a passive, which I will show you guys here, called Undaunted Melee, which basically you get increase your max health, stam, and magicka by 2% per the type of armor, that being heavy, medium, and light, which means we're getting a 6% bonus. There's really no reason to not give yourself the 6% bonus for PvP. So you're always going to want to have one heavy, one medium, and then the rest light armor. So that's the 1-1-5 setup, as it's referred to. And now, one of my favorite parts, where I just start talking to you guys about different sets. So I really want to hit this point home with you guys, though, that you can use so many set combinations. I generally just recommend having one defensive setup. I don't think that you really need a recovery setup unless you are becoming a stage 3 vampire, but we'll, again, still table that for a second. And hopefully this shows you guys that I have a lot of experience testing out different, different types of setups for the sorcerer, because these are all things that I've tested on my sorcerer. We're going to pretty much talk about all these to a differing degree. So let's talk about why some of these sets are good. Bright Throat Boast, you may see it recommended. However, not a huge fan of being tethered to using drinks. Also, not a huge fan of all the recovery it gives you. I don't need all the magicka recovery. If I wanted that recovery, I would get it from somewhere different. Ancient Grace, I think that's a really decent set. The drawbacks are, though, that it's not on the body, so you're pretty much forced to use it on the weapons and jewelry slots. Necropotence, huge fan of Necropotence. I generally wouldn't recommend it on a staff slot, however, because if you can't bar swap to a different one, because, for example, sometimes I like to backbar Potentates. And I can't backbar Potentates if I have Necropotence or Ancient Grace on there, because then I would lose the magicka, which could be a little bit annoying to deal with. But if I was to use Potentates, I generally recommend this is only a 2-piece set. That would reduce your damage taken by players by 3%. You're generally not going to want to put this with something like the Markin ring, because then you're basically using what I would refer to as almost a monster set. You're only using a 2-piece set, but it still is something really nice to consider for backbarred pieces. Mother Sara, it's not relevant. Medusa, not relevant. And Necropotent Staff, we talked about that. Willpower, not hugely against willpower. I just am not a fan of the weapon and spell damage. I don't think it really adds a whole lot to us. Because as we stack... So another thing to consider too is, say I have 10,000 magicka, and I have all these passives, like the Undaunted passive, which is like 6%. Well, that 6% is going to continue to stack as your magicka goes up. That's why I generally recommend, if you're going to go weapon and spell damage, you go all weapon and spell damage. I think that that's the way that you guys want to do it. Or you go all magicka, health, and stamina. I believe in the all or nothing approach, because you want those percentage buffs to stack. And that's where we get to stuff like Moonhunter. I think that Moonhunter has a place in sorcerers, but it's not the place of the traditional build. It goes into more of like the ganking build. You could pair this with something like Stiggins and Stage 4 Vampirism, coming out of stealth, using like rogue potions to go into stealth and having more versatility and speed. You could even consider using this with like something like Ring of the Wild Hunt. I think that there is definitely a place for Moonhunter where you get spell damage, crit, and then spell damage, but I just don't think it's with the traditional Sorc setup. Spinners is another decent set that you guys can find yourself. Sometimes as the tank meta rolls around, sometimes it's nice to slap on something that gives you a little more penetration. This also brings up an interesting point. What trait do I run? You may notice that I actually have both. Generally, if the people are tankier, we slap on the Sharpen. If the people are squishier, we slap on Nernhold. Sometimes I will switch these in between deaths in a battleground if I notice that people are one way or another. That's why you'll see that I sometimes have 2 of each staff. New Moon Alkalite also, by the way, used to be a wholly popular. This is technically, it's a proc set, but it is also one of those ones I don't really consider a proc set. It really comes down to that same thing we were talking about earlier, always having 400 weapon and spell damage with offensive penetration, spell damage, and crit. Neat on paper, in practicality, it's going to really be something you're going to contour more to like a ganking sorcerer, maybe even a bombing sorcerer. One other item, though, that I almost make the exception for is I am a huge fan of the Master's Perfected Inferno Staff. I really do like that 600 weapon and spell damage. That's also very tailored to my playstyle because I like to start off and frequently use Flame Clench. That is Destructive Touch's fire version. I'm a huge fan of it, but please don't take my bias as a personal endorsement because while I do think it's good, you got to remember, 600 weapon and spell damage for 4 seconds is equivalent to about 6,000 magicka. How much magicka are we losing 100% of the time to gain it for 4 seconds of that increased damage, and then with a minor reduced cost? So you always have to be thinking that in the backs of your head. Bright Throat Boast. This will also bring up an interesting point where we talk about abilities, because sometimes I honestly am a fan of using the resto staffs. Now, if you're using a resto staff, you're probably not going to run the pet. We'll talk about that when we get to abilities. However, like I said earlier, if you're really interested in running a really well-versed sorcerer, a good option is Armor Master. It's a great setup. It gives you a lot of ability. You can put 3 pieces on the body, and then you can back bar the resto staff, so that way you only get it when you switch to your back bar. Because look, at the bottom here, when you use an armor ability while in combat, your physical and spell resistance is increased by 5940 for 10 seconds. That means that you can still switch to your back bar and go back to your front bar and still have that really nice buff. So that's why I think the Armor Master, if you're not going to use like a Gaze of Sithis or a Markin ring to get a little bit extra resistance, even if Death Dealer's Feet will give you a little bit more health and whatnot, if you're not using one of those and you don't want to use a Mythical, I really recommend the Armor Master. It's a great setup for you guys to use. But as you may notice, as I'm talking to you, I'm not telling you that you have to do something specific. Why is that? And that's because you don't. If you notice in combat, for example, that you're going in and you're noticing a very specific set of circumstances, my goal for this video is to teach you how to change those items. My goal is to teach you how to go and to tweak your own builds and how to go in and know at any given point what you need as a player. And I think that's what my key is for this video, is to make sure that you guys know what you guys should be doing. So we're going to talk briefly about Vampirism after we talk about abilities, because abilities are very important in my opinion, because everyone that you see on YouTube is going to recommend a different setup. So let's just talk about why I run this setup, what changes you can make, and whatnot. I will also say, if you play on Xbox, I highly encourage you guys to reroute your controller to make it to where when you press the right thumbstick, it bar swaps for you, because bar swapping with the D-pad sucks. So, why do I like this front bar? It's got a stun, a really nice heal, which is our Twilight Matriarch. It's got a really nice procable Crystal Frag attack. It's got 2 really nice kind of like proc sets where it's like we could put these on people and then they detonate, and we can time that to perfection, and we have a super powerful Ice Comet. Why is Ice Comet so helpful too? Is because when we use Mages Guild and Fighters Guild abilities, we actually get bonuses. See, it's always important to consider too, because we are getting these bonuses such as Maximum Magicka and Magicka Recovery for just having these abilities slotted on our bars. So, very important for you guys to consider. Which actually brings us to the back bar. where I have the ward. Now, some people would put the ward on the front bar. If you feel like you're constantly getting attacked and you're lagging before you could do that, there's nothing wrong with putting the ward on your front bar. You can easily put something like Curse, which procs after, a period of time. There's nothing wrong with putting that on the back bar. Some people actually put Streak and only use Streak as their actual stun. They don't even use Flame Clench. So I could put Streak on my front bar, get rid of this, and then put on like Ellie Drain or something. Or maybe I wanted to put on like Inner Light, which would give me Major Prophecy and Savagery, but it would also increase my Max Magicka by 5%. Which means that if I put this back here, now my shields have gotten stronger because I have more Magicka. So you see, like, there's all these things that you can do, and I now have more Magicka. Let's see if I were to switch my front bar. Yeah, now it's 54k versus 52.8. These are all things that I want you guys to be considering. Now you might be wondering too, Jake, why are you using a Sigic Order back here? Well, I use this because at all times I get minor protection, which I'm just a huge fan of. I generally will only use this ultimate anyway. So that's why on the back bar it's nice to just have something. It just gives me minor protection, reducing your damage taken by 5%. Sometimes there's times where you may want to use this. It's not super expensive, 114 ultimate. It's actually cheaper than the Ice Comet. And it will take you back in time, 4 seconds. If you played Overwatch, it's very similar to that. But again, this is more so about teaching rather than me just telling you how to do something. So, for example, I really like Dark Exchange. I think Dark Exchange is a really nice heal in a pinch, and it also turns your stamina to Magicka, which could be wholly helpful. It also gives us the ability to kind of manage our resources in combat, which is why I recommend Tri Potions. We'll talk a little bit about potions when we get to consumables at the end, but it makes it to where we can easily run something like Tri Potions, because if we're in combat, we're going to be using mag, health, and stamina. We're going to be dodge rolling, we're going to be casting abilities, and we're going to be doing all sorts of other stuff. I am a fan of the stamina morph of Lightning Form. I think that while you'd only get minor expedition, but getting that for 15 seconds versus getting it for 3 seconds, I think is very big. And I also am just a fan of the damage that it does and the size in which it does also. So that's why I'm a huge fan of that. But there's a lot of skills that you could do. There's huge fans of Crushing Shock. There's people who are huge fans of the Sigic Order, Ellie Weapon. There's people who are a fan of all sorts and combinations. And do not feel like you can't experiment with these. For example, if I was really going pedal to the metal, I could throw Ellie Drain on here. Maybe I'm in a battleground, and I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. I don't need Blink. Like, if I'm playing Capture the Relic or something, and I can't Blink anyway, and I have the Relic, maybe I'll just throw on Ellie Drain. It's also a great way, if you're like a Stage 3 Vampire, to get your Magicka back, and also limit the Magicka that your other guy has, and reduce their... For 23 seconds is quite a long period of time, so... There's a lot that you guys can do with this stuff. I know I've been hitting on that a lot, but I hate so much when people copy builds and they just don't like it. They just feel like, well, it didn't work out for me. They go through all this effort to get all the gear, get the right traits, they try it out, they don't like it, and then they move on. I absolutely hate that mentality, and that is what I am trying to break you guys out of. Because now let's talk about Vampirism just a little bit before we talk about Munduses, Consumables, and so on. So the main reason I could skip right to it to be a vampire is Undeath. Why is Undeath so helpful? And that's because you don't generally have as much health as most other classes. That's why Gaze's Sithis and Death Dealer's Feet are so helpful. But if you're not using those, or you just naturally don't have 30k health, and even 30k health, if you were to go to a battleground right now and survey all the people around you, they're probably going to have more than 30k health, which means you're generally going to be in execute range more often. 30k health, your execute range is only going to be about 10k, and you're going to be around 10k health more than you wish to admit. So being able to have that is pretty helpful. There are some people that run Stage 4. If you are going to run Stage 4, generally, though, you're going to be doing some sort of procced weapon and spell damage build where you're coming out of stealth, taking ass and eating names or whatever. I don't know the saying. Potato, potato, and you're going to be able to get those bonuses. You also do get the ability when you leave sneak ability or misform to gain 300 spell damage, weapon damage. You could, in theory, also run misform. Misform is a pretty popular set for PvP, and you have a lot of magicka to run it for a long period of time. So if you guys did want to run a misform, two very, very good ones too. Blood Mist is super popular. Increasing your movement speed is also really popular, so either one of these is a really good option for you guys to do too for Vampirism. I don't think Vampirism is necessary. In fact, if you're using it with Gaze of Sithis, I'd actually get rid of it. I'd cure it, because you are going to have, like right now, I have 2,000 health recovery. I'd have even more health recovery if I just, cured myself. So if you're not going to use the benefits, don't beat it all. It's pretty much 3, 4, or 0. Don't be a stage 1 vampire. You could, in theory, use it for the ultimate. The problem is if we use the ultimate, while we would be getting, tons of stats, one, it doesn't last very long. It's not like we're turning into a vampire, unfortunately. And overall, we're not going to be getting those passive buffs either. Like by having Meteor Arm, we get 2% maximum magicka. 2% maximum magicka may sound like an insignificant number, but you have to remember, that's like 1 point something K magicka, because we have over 50K magicka. So 2% of that is a really high number. That's almost like a 1-piece set buff, or like a 2 or 3rd piece set buff. Like, that's pretty good. So that's my thoughts on Vampirism for you guys. And Werewolf, obviously, this isn't really something that you would find applicable with that. And now we have Mundus Stones, which may seem like an easy choice for you guys, but this is where I want you guys to consider your first point of changeability. So for example, say you guys copy my build to a T. You use everything that I'm using right now, all the same abilities. You slap on Blink, you get rid of LE Strain, and you're like, man, I find myself dealing with X. Well, this is where we talk about X. Do you need more health? Perhaps you would like to use the Lord. Let's say I put this bad boy on right now. Let's see what this does. So now let's see what this does to my shields. Now my shields are 1.7k stronger than they were previously. And now I find myself with 32.9k total max magicka. Let's say I'm like, man, I am constantly not doing enough penetration. You could switch to get yourself some more penetration. You want your magicka back? Well, wham bam, thank you, ma'am. Now you got your magicka back. We're not really going to be using the healing done. Not going to be really interested in stamina. Critical damage, you could consider that for like your DPS builds. Now, increased speed is another really interesting one. Say you're like, man, Jake, I want to get rid of something, for example, like if you're going to use like a 1-bar Oakensoul ring, you still want to have that mobility. How do you get it? You can slap on the steed and give yourself some decent amount of health recovery as well. This would, imagine the health recovery too with the Gaze of Sithis. If we cured our Vampirism, basically you're going to be healing ourselves every second passively. The Thief, if we wanted to increase our weapon and spell crit strikes rating. Or you look at the Tower if we wanted some stamina. Say, for example, if we were using like health and magicka buff foods. If we wanted to, or we wouldn't really increase our weapon damage, we increase our spell damage. What does this take us to? So this will take us to about 3593. Not too shabby. Now again, obviously, like, oh, maybe I'm a stage 3 or 4 vampire, and I'm like, man, my regeneration sucks. Well, wham bam, thank you, ma'am. Now look at that. I'm at 1277 magicka recovery. Shee! So that's where I want you. This is the first point. If you're like, man, Jake, my build needs a tweaking. I want your first go-to to be your Mundus Stone. So often, people farm new 5-piece sets, new mythicals, they gold out new things, they get new glyphs, when there's such easy small tweaks that you guys can make with your Mundus Stones. It just hurts, sometimes to see such things. So this is going to be your guys' first little point that I'm going to point you guys to. The next is going to be buff foods. There's different types of buff foods. The ones that I switch between the most are probably Bewitched Sugar Skulls and Corrupting Bloody Maras, which I'm actually out of. Now, you could also use the Pickled Fishbowl. Why would you use the Pickled Fishbowl, Jake? You would lose the magicka recovery. But, just take a look at our magicka now. Actually, we switch to the front bar so we get an accurate look. Do you see this now? Let's say I'm constantly going through it. I'm like, man, I just don't need all this stamina. Well, let's eat this. And now we've got more magicka, more health, and less stamina. It will always come down to what you guys feel like you need. And that's what I'm like trying to bash over your heads. I want you guys to feel confident in being able to tweak things. Same with potions. You don't have to use tri-potions. You could use Alliance spell drops. You could use these DPS boys. If you find yourself constantly on the cusp, you know, buffing yourself and nobody's coming at you, you can also activate your little wheel in combat. I do this right now currently. Switch through, pop one of these bad boys, just wham, 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 you know. Constantly hit these bad boys. And that's where I think the key comes in is start with your consumables, start with your Mundus stones. Also, too, don't feel afraid to put triune glyphs on, or tri-stack glyphs. You could do triune crystals on your jewelry if you would so want. Don't feel afraid to start there either, especially on your big body pieces. Like if you wanted to, you know, switch this to a health one. Say you're running the Markin ring, and you're like, man, I have so much resistance and extra damage, but I'm constantly getting the dickens. Or you're running Death Dealer's Feet, and you're like, man, I don't get a lot of health right away, and that's a bit of a problem. Then I'll be like, well, have you considered putting on a health enchant? Switching out 1 or 2 enchants on a gold, you know, piece of clothing is much cheaper than buying a whole new piece of gold, you know, of jewelry or armor or weapons. So please, please, please start there. I'm also a fan of poisons. My favorite ones are escapist poisons. You just look at what this does. It mobilizes your target, grants you unstoppable, which makes you immune to crowd control effects, which is super helpful, especially because you always want to have that mobility constantly going. But I'm also a huge fan of sorcery drain, reducing their damage on you and increasing your spell power by 10%, giving them minor uncertainty. Is also pretty cool, and then it drains their magicka. So this is kind of like an LE drain without the LE drain. Again, there's a lot of things that you guys could do with this. And then the back bar trait, I don't think I touched upon this, but I do use defending. Generally, what I will do is I'll put like escapist on the back bar, and then sorcery drain on the front bar, and then whichever one will proc based on whichever one I'm currently light attacking, based on what I need in that moment. You also obviously can use different types of enchants. If you were looking for something like infused, give yourself your weapon damage back. Now you're probably going to want something, you know, pretty good if you're going to be running that, like your weapon and spell damage being increased for 5 seconds. You would then get 7 seconds. I personally just prefer defending, again, because I like to have all the stats all the time. Maybe that sounds a little wacky-tacky, but I just like to have the total stats. There's definitely pros and cons to using procs versus no procs. This is definitely a very non-proc heavy build, even though technically we are using some proc sets. But overall, this is a very good sorcerer setup, but I really hope that this was helpful for you guys. The final point that I wanted to wrap up with is there's tons of races. I don't want to really spend the time because this video is very bloated going over all of them. But just know, a lot of them has pros and cons. Some have more stam, more mag, more health. Some do more damage. Some have, you know, higher regenerations. Basically, just build that into everything we were talking about. If you saw certain sets and you said, you know, maybe I do want to build like a very stealth-heavy, you know, burst DPS. I could maybe do a high elf and get even more damage because I don't need that, you know, and I could be a vampire with it because I'm, you know, going to kill people right away, go back into stealth. Or you're like, man, I really like the Breton ability to make everything cheaper. That pairs really well with Vampirism because that makes things more expensive. That pairs so well together. Maybe you're like, man, a Dark Elf gives me more stamina. I'm constantly rolling with the gaze of Sithis. Maybe a Dark Elf is better for me. But again, all of those good things can be mixed without changing your race because you look at around us. We got all these Mundus stones that can do all these things for us. Never feel like you can't tweak your own build. You don't have to watch somebody else's YouTube video for them to tell you like, oh, you know, this is how you should build this guy. No, you know you. If you're like me and you get hit constantly because you suck at going behind obstacles, you might need a little more defense. If you're like my friends who like to play 5,000 feet away from the conflict, you might not need a lot of that because you're not going to be hit. You might want more damage. You might want battle orcs because you're constantly out of the fray. So that's where it comes down to playstyle, and that's why I can't critique you. I want you to feel like you can critique you. So this is going to wrap up my build video. I am definitely afraid to see how this does on YouTube because, oh my gosh, this is a long video. Oh god. Well, I hope that it does well, and I hope that it doesn't take me like 50 hours to upload this, but again, if one person finds this helpful, that's all it means to me. And again, if you guys wouldn't mind liking the video, that would be so helpful for me because this is such a long video and I talked about so many things and oh, I can already hear the comments. So, alright guys, I'll catch you guys tomorrow. Peace.
You better remember to like and subscribe to Jake Clips. Or you should. I might have to pluck your eyes if you don't. Or, better yet, I'll skip rope with your entrails. Do it now. Subscribe. Ta-ta. Off with you.